There is something happening in your mind right now that you have never been taught to question. Not because it is subtle, but because it has always felt obvious. Thoughts appear one after another, narrating your life, explaining your experiences, predicting what comes next. And from the very first moment you became self-aware, you were taught, implicitly, silently, that this stream is you, that the voice commenting on your life is the one living it. But what if that assumption is the most expensive mistake you've ever made? You've never been asked to pause and examine how thinking actually happens. Thoughts arrive fully formed. They don't ask permission. They don't announce their origin. They simply appear, carrying emotion, certainty, urgency, and you respond to them automatically. Agreement happens instantly. Identification happens instantly. A thought says something about you, about the world, about what's possible or not possible, and before you even notice it happening, your body reacts, your mood shifts, your sense of self contracts or expands, and life begins responding to that state. This has been happening so fast for so long that it never felt optional. Most people assume they are consciously producing their thoughts. That thinking is an active process they are in control of. But if you slow down, just slightly, you may notice something uncomfortable. You don't actually choose the next thought before it arrives. You don't preview it. You don't author it sentence by sentence. It appears already shaped, already framed, already pointing in a direction. And then you follow. You've been living inside this automatic agreement without ever being shown an alternative. And the cost of that agreement is far greater than most people realize, because every time a thought appears and is taken as truth, it becomes more than an idea. It becomes an identity. A thought about fear becomes you being afraid. A thought about limitation becomes you being limited. A thought about the future becomes your future. The mind doesn't just describe reality, recruits your nervous system to behave as if its commentary is final. This is where suffering quietly begins. Not because thoughts are negative, but because they are believed without question. Because they are treated as accurate reflections of reality instead of internal events. Because no one ever taught you to notice the difference between a mental narration and what is actually happening. So the mind speaks, the body responds, and reality mirrors the state you're broadcasting. Over and over again, until it feels like life itself is confirming what the mind has been saying all along. You've felt this loop, even if you've never named it. You may have noticed how certain themes repeat in your life. The same emotional reactions, the same doubts, the same internal conversations resurfacing in different situations with different people in different years, but with the same tone. And because these patterns feel familiar, they feel personal, they feel like you. But familiarity is not the same thing as truth. And repetition is not the same thing as authorship. Here's the part most people miss. The mind is not responding to the present moment as often as you think. Much of what you experience as thinking is actually replay. Old interpretations, old conclusions, old protective strategies installed long before your current life circumstances existed. Yet each time they appear, they carry the same authority, because you've never been shown how to question the assumption that they are coming from you. And so, life unfolds through this invisible filter. You don't enter situations neutrally, you enter them already primed by internal commentary. Before a conversation happens, the mind predicts how it will go. Before an opportunity unfolds, the mind explains why it might fail. Before peace can settle, the mind reminds you of unfinished business. And because this all feels internal, it feels intimate. It feels like insight. But insight does not arrive as compulsion, and truth does not need urgency. If this is resonating, it's not because you're learning something new. It's because something in you recognizes the pattern. You've sensed at times that your reactions were happening faster than your choice, that certain emotional responses didn't actually belong to the moment you were in, that the voice inside your head seemed to run ahead of reality, filling in the gaps before life had a chance to speak for itself. This is not a flaw, it's conditioning. And it leads to one quiet but critical question that most people never allow themselves to ask. If the mind is producing thoughts automatically, if they arrive without permission, without preview, without conscious assembly, then what exactly have you been identifying with all this time? Because if you are the mind, you should be able to stop it. And if you are the author, you should know where each thought comes from before it arrives. But neither of those things is actually true in direct experience. Thoughts come, reactions follow. And something else, something quieter, is present the entire time, watching it all happen. You may not have language for that yet, and that's intentional. For now, it's enough to notice the crack in the assumption. The possibility that the voice you've been treating as yourself may simply be a function, not an identity, a process, not a presence, because once that assumption starts to loosen, even slightly, your entire relationship with your inner world begins to change. And what comes next is not philosophy, it's not belief, it's something you can verify directly. The moment you stop assuming the mind is who you are and start seeing what's actually been here the whole time. And this is where everything begins to shift. Now we can say it plainly because you're ready to see it without turning it into belief. Your mind produces thoughts, but it is not producing you. And this distinction is not philosophical. It is not spiritual language. It is something you can verify right now in your own experience without effort, without technique, and without adopting a new identity. Notice what just happened as you read that sentence. A response arose, perhaps agreement, perhaps resistance, perhaps curiosity. That response appeared instantly before you decided what to feel about it. That alone tells you something important. The mind reacts faster than conscious choice. It always has. And yet something in you noticed the reaction. Something registered it without being altered by it. That noticing is not thinking. It never has been. This is where the illusion begins to fracture. For most of your life, you've been taught, implicitly, that consciousness is a byproduct of thinking, that awareness emerges from the mind. But when you examine your direct experience, the opposite is true. Thoughts appear within awareness. They come and go. They change tone. They contradict one another. They disappear entirely at times. And yet awareness remains constant, present when thinking is loud, present when thinking is quiet, present even when thinking stops altogether. If awareness were produced by the mind, it would fluctuate with thought, but it doesn't. It stays. Neuroscience quietly confirms what experience already shows. By the time you become consciously aware of a thought or a decision, the brain has already initiated the process hundreds of milliseconds earlier. Neural activity precedes conscious recognition, which means what you experience as "I'm thinking" is actually a report, not an origin. The mind generates content. Awareness receives it. And then, only afterward, identity steps in and claims ownership. This claiming is automatic, it's conditioned. And it's the mechanism that turns neutral mental activity into personal reality. When a thought appears and is believed, it doesn't stay mental, it becomes physiological. Muscles tighten, breathing changes, hormones shift. The nervous system reorganizes around the meaning the thought carries. And because the body doesn't distinguish between imagination and immediate reality, it responds as if the thought is describing something real, present, and urgent. This is how thought becomes experience. And because this happens thousands of times a day, it creates the feeling of continuity, a solid self moving through time, reacting, deciding, struggling, hoping. But that continuity is built from identification, not awareness. It's the result of mistaking mental narration for identity. You felt this most clearly in moments when thinking paused, perhaps during exhaustion, perhaps during intense focus, perhaps in moments of awe, grief, or stillness. In those moments, the sense of me didn't disappear, but the voice did, and yet you were still here, aware, present, intact. That alone tells you something fundamental. You are not absent when thinking stops, which means thinking cannot be what you are. This doesn't mean thoughts are wrong or useless. The mind is a brilliant instrument. It predicts, it analyzes, it protects, it builds models of the world so you can navigate complexity. but it was never meant to be an identity. And the moment it is treated as one, it oversteps its function and begins shaping reality in ways it was never designed to control. This is where suffering quietly multiplies, because when the mind is believed to be you, every thought carries existential weight. A fearful prediction becomes a threat to your safety. A critical comment becomes a statement about your worth. A doubt becomes a limitation on your future, and life responds, not to the thought itself, but to the state your body enters when that thought is believed. Reality doesn't respond to ideas, it responds to coherence. When identification collapses into thought, the signal you broadcast becomes unstable. It fluctuates constantly, hopeful one moment, fearful the next, confident, then doubtful, open, then defensive. And reality mirrors that instability with inconsistency, resistance, and repetition. Not as punishment, but as feedback. This is why trying to think positively rarely works. You can replace one mental sentence with another, but if identification remains in the mind, the signal is still fragmented. Affirmations layered on top of unconscious belief don't change the broadcast, they only add noise. But something very different happens the moment identification loosens. When a thought appears and is recognized as a mental event, not a command, not a truth, not a definition, the body doesn't mobilize around it. The nervous system stays regulated, breathing remains natural, muscles soften, and the signal you emit becomes coherent, not because you're controlling anything, but because you've stopped confusing narration with reality. This is the beginning of real freedom. You don't need to stop thoughts. You don't need to fight the mind. You don't need to transcend anything. You simply need to see clearly what has always been happening. The mind produces content. Awareness receives it. An identity has been mistakenly assigned to the wrong place. Once that is seen, not intellectually but experientially, the grip of thinking begins to loosen on its own. Not all at once, not permanently, but enough for space to appear, enough for choice to re-enter, enough for reality to stop being filtered entirely through old mental patterns. And this is where another layer reveals itself, because if you look closely at the thoughts that arise, you'll notice something else. They are not fresh. They are not spontaneous responses to the present moment. They repeat, they recycle, they follow familiar themes, the same concerns, the same doubts, the same anticipations appearing in different disguises. This is not intuition, this is conditioning. The mind is a prediction engine. It builds its expectations from the past and projects them forward, which means much of what you experience as thinking is actually memory speaking in the present tense. Old interpretations replaying themselves through new circumstances. And because you've been identifying with these loops, they've been treated as current reality instead of outdated programming. But once you recognize that you are not the thinking mind, these loops lose their authority. They can still appear, but they no longer define, they no longer dictate, they no longer shape your entire internal state by default. You begin to see them for what they are, patterns, not prophecies. And this is where the shift becomes tangible. Because when identification moves out of the mind and into awareness itself, reality begins responding differently, not because you're forcing change, but because the signal you're broadcasting has stabilized. You are no longer reacting from thought. You are observing through awareness, and this sets the stage for understanding where these repetitive patterns actually come from, why they feel personal, why they feel persistent, and why dissolving their origin changes everything. Once the illusion loosens, once you see that the thinking mind is producing content rather than identity, something else becomes impossible to ignore. The patterns, the repetition, the way certain inner narratives return again and again, even when your life circumstances change. Different environments, different people, different years, and yet the same internal themes quietly resurfacing. This isn't coincidence. And it isn't intuition, it's architecture. The mind does not primarily exist to tell the truth. It exists to predict. Its fundamental function is survival, not accuracy. It scans past experiences, extracts patterns, and uses them to anticipate what might happen next. And it does this constantly, automatically, without waiting for your conscious involvement. The result is that much of what you experience as thinking is not responding to what is happening now, but to what once happened before. This is why certain reactions feel so familiar, why fear arises before danger appears, why doubt surfaces before effort begins, why tension enters the body before a conversation even starts. The mind is not waiting to see what happens. It is projecting memory forward and calling it preparation. And because you've been identifying with this process, those projections have been treated as reality. Consider how this plays out in ordinary life. Before a difficult conversation, the body tightens. The mind starts narrating outcomes. Past moments are replayed, not as memories, but as expectations. Tone of voice, facial expressions, imagined responses. None of it has happened yet, and yet the nervous system responds as if it already has. You enter the moment altered by a future that exists only in prediction. This is how the past keeps reenacting itself. These mental loops are not random. They were installed at specific moments, usually early, usually emotionally charged, usually before you had the ability to contextualize what was happening. A moment of comparison, a moment of rejection, a moment of confusion or overwhelm. The mind learned something then. It formed a conclusion, and that conclusion became a template. Over time, the template hardened into habit. The thought patterns that arise today often have very little to do with who you are now. They are not evaluations of your current capability. They are echoes of earlier interpretations that once served a protective purpose but have long outlived their usefulness. Yet because they arise internally, they feel intimate. Because they repeat, they feel convincing, and because they've been identified with, they feel personal. But repetition is not intelligence, it is inertia. Once you recognize this, something subtle but profound shifts. You stop asking whether a thought is true and start asking where it comes from, not intellectually. Somatically, you notice the familiar tone, the emotional charge, the way the body responds before meaning is assigned. And instead of following the loop forward, you trace it backward. This is not analysis, it is recognition. You may suddenly remember a moment you hadn't thought about in years, a situation where the same internal sensation first appeared, a time when the world felt unsafe or unpredictable or conditional. The thought you are having now did not originate in the present. It is an old strategy replaying itself in new scenery. And once you see that, the authority dissolves, because an echo cannot command the present. A memory cannot dictate the future. A pattern does not deserve obedience simply because it is familiar. The moment a thought is recognized as old programming rather than current truth, it loses its power to shape your state. This does not mean it disappears immediately. Patterns rarely vanish on first contact, but their grip loosens. The emotional charge fades faster. The body recovers more quickly. Space opens between the appearance of the thought and your response to it, and in that space, choice returns. This is why awareness is not passive, it is corrective. The mind will continue to do what it has always done. It will generate predictions. It will scan for threats. It will attempt to control outcomes by rehearsing them internally. But once identification has shifted, these activities no longer define you. They become background processes rather than governing forces. And this is where many people get confused. They expect liberation to feel dramatic. They expect thoughts to stop. They expect silence. But real change is quieter. It feels like neutrality where there was once urgency, like options where there was once compulsion, like presence where there was once anticipation. You still think, you still plan, you still evaluate, but you are no longer pulled into the same gravitational field. The mind's output becomes information instead of instruction, and something else becomes visible here, something most people never notice because they are too busy managing their internal noise. Not all repetitive thinking comes from your personal past. In fact, a significant portion of it doesn't belong to your history at all. Many of the thoughts you carry were never formed through direct experience. They were absorbed, picked up through conversation, media, cultural narratives, family dynamics, collective fear, collective expectation, ideas about success, failure, safety, worth, inherited, not discovered. The mind is porous. It doesn't distinguish between lived experience and repeated exposure. If something is heard often enough, felt strongly enough, or reinforced socially, it becomes internalized. And once internalized, it is treated as personal truth. This is why entire populations can become anxious about things they have never personally encountered. Why beliefs spread faster than evidence. Why emotional climates shift collectively. The mind is not an isolated system. It is constantly tuning into the environments it moves through. But here is the liberating part. Once you are no longer identifying with the mind, you don't have to carry what it absorbs. A thought can arise from collective conditioning and pass through awareness without landing. You don't need to suppress it. You don't need to argue with it. You simply don't need to be it. And without identification, it cannot recruit your nervous system. It cannot stabilize as a signal. It dissolves on its own. This dramatically reduces mental noise. What remains is not emptiness, but clarity. The mind still functions, but it no longer runs unchecked. You become selective without effort, responsive without rehearsal, present without force. And this is where the shift begins to extend beyond your inner world. Because when old programming loses its authority, when inherited narratives are no longer automatically believed, the signal you emit into the world changes. You are no longer broadcasting fear that isn't yours. You are no longer amplifying patterns that no longer apply. You are no longer reinforcing loops simply by reacting to them. The past stops masquerading as the present. And when that happens, reality begins to reorganize in subtle but unmistakable ways. Not because you are controlling outcomes, but because you have stopped projecting outdated interpretations onto what is unfolding now. This is the threshold, the point where understanding turns into transformation, where recognition becomes coherence, where the mind returns to its proper role, and something deeper begins to lead. And this is where the response from reality itself becomes impossible to ignore. At this point, something important needs to be clarified. Reality is not responding to your ideas. It is not reacting to your hopes, your affirmations, or your intentions in the way most people imagine. Reality responds to coherence. It responds to the internal state you stabilize, the signal you consistently broadcast through your nervous system, your posture, your tone, your presence. And that signal is shaped not by what you think, but by what you identify with. When the mind is mistaken for identity, every thought becomes a command, not because it is true, but because it is believed. The moment a thought is believed, it recruits the body. Breathing becomes shallow or expansive. Muscles tighten or soften, attention narrows or opens, hormones shift. This is not metaphor, it is physiology. And physiology is the language reality understands. This is how identification turns into experience. You are not walking through life as a neutral observer who occasionally thinks. You are walking through life as a signaling system. Your body is constantly broadcasting information about what you expect, what you fear, what you assume, and what you are prepared for. And that broadcast is read by other nervous systems instantly, without words. Before a conversation begins, the tone is set. Before an opportunity unfolds, a posture has already been taken. Before life responds, a signal has already been sent. This is why patterns persist, even when you consciously want something different. You may say you want ease, but if the mind is identified with vigilance, the signal remains defensive. You may say you want connection, but if the mind is identified with self-protection, the signal remains guarded. You may say you want abundance, but if the mind is identified with scarcity, the signal remains constricted. Reality does not respond to what you say you want, it responds to the state you are actually inhabiting, and that state is shaped by identification. When a thought arises and is taken as truth, it does more than inform. It organizes, the body aligns with it, perception filters through it, attention searches for confirmation, memory highlights evidence. And slowly, without conscious intent, reality begins reflecting the internal assumption back to you. Not because it agrees, but because it mirrors coherence. This is the mechanism behind self-fulfilling loops. A person who identifies with distrust enters interactions guarded. Others feel it and respond cautiously. The person then experiences confirmation. See, people can't be trusted. A person who identifies with inadequacy hesitates, overthinks, or withholds. Opportunities pass or arrive distorted. Confirmation follows. See, I'm not capable. The loop is not psychological punishment, it is feedback. Reality is showing you what you are stabilizing. This is why effort alone rarely breaks these cycles. You can force behavior, you can discipline habits, you can override impulses temporarily, but if identification remains in the same place, the signal does not change. And if the signal does not change, reality reorganizes back into the same patterns once the effort relaxes. This is also why simply replacing one belief with another often fails. Positive language layered on top of unconscious identification does not produce coherence, it produces contradiction. The mind says one thing, the body broadcasts another. Reality responds to the stronger signal, and that signal is always the one tied to identity. But now, something crucial has shifted, because once you recognize that the thinking mind is producing content rather than self, identification no longer happens automatically. A thought can arise without being believed. Meaning can appear without being embodied. And when that happens, the body remains neutral. The nervous system stays regulated, the signal stabilizes. This is not suppression, it is disengagement. The thought still appears. The difference is that it no longer recruits the system. It no longer collapses awareness into reaction. It no longer becomes the lens through which reality is observed. And because it doesn't stabilize as a state, it doesn't get mirrored back. This is where the loop breaks. You may notice this first in small ways. Situations that once triggered immediate response now create a pause. Emotional reactions arise but dissipate faster. Conversations feel less charged, decisions feel less urgent. You are still present, perhaps more present than ever, but without the internal pressure that once accompanied every choice. This is coherence returning. When identification shifts out of the mind and into awareness itself, the signal becomes simple, stable, readable. There is no internal argument, no oscillation between states, no constant recalibration. Awareness does not fluctuate the way thought does. It does not need to prove anything. It does not brace or anticipate. And because of that, it emits a signal that is calm, grounded, and consistent. Reality responds to this immediately, not always dramatically, not always visibly at first, but unmistakably. Interactions soften, timing improves, friction reduces, things begin aligning without force, not because you are controlling outcomes, but because you are no longer distorting the field through unconscious identification. This is where many people misinterpret what is happening. They attribute the change to luck, coincidence, or external shifts. But the deeper cause is internal coherence. The signal has changed, and reality, which is always listening, responds accordingly. This also explains why awareness-based presence feels magnetic. People feel seen without being analyzed, heard without being evaluated, met without agenda. This is not charisma, it is coherence. Other nervous systems relax in its presence because there is no contradiction being broadcast. And this brings us to an uncomfortable but liberating realization. Much of what you've experienced as resistance in life was not opposition, it was reflection. Life showing you the state you were inhabiting, not the one you intended. This is not something to judge or fix, it is something to recognize, because once you see how identification shapes signal and how signal shapes response, the focus naturally shifts. You stop trying to change reality directly, you stop negotiating with outcomes, you stop forcing alignment. Instead, you attend to where you are observing from, to what you are identifying with, to what state you are stabilizing beneath the activity of the mind. And when that stabilizes in awareness rather than thought, reality no longer needs to push back. It can finally respond. But there is still one more layer to this, one that explains why so much mental activity feels personal even when it isn't, why certain fears feel inherited, why entire emotional climates seem to move through populations at once. and why disengaging from identification doesn't just change your internal world, but clears space around you as well. As awareness stabilizes and identification loosens, another layer of recognition emerges naturally, one that does not arrive as a revelation, but as a quiet clarity. Much of the mental activity you experience throughout the day does not originate from your immediate life or direct experience. It moves through you because the mind is designed to absorb, register, and echo the environments it inhabits. From early childhood onward, it learns patterns not only from what happens to you personally, but from what is repeatedly observed, heard, implied, and emotionally reinforced around you. Over time, these impressions become familiar, and familiarity gives them the feeling of ownership. The mind does not distinguish between lived experience and repeated exposure. If a message is encountered often enough, especially when paired with emotion or authority, it becomes internalized as part of the mental landscape. Beliefs about safety, success, belonging, scarcity, urgency, and worth can settle into the system without ever being consciously chosen. Once internalized, they arise as thoughts that feel personal, even though their origin lies outside your direct experience. This is why certain concerns persist even when nothing in your immediate life is demanding them. This process happens continuously and efficiently. Information flows in through conversation, media, social environments, and subtle emotional cues. The mind registers tone as much as content, atmosphere as much as fact. Over time, entire emotional climates can be absorbed and replayed internally. Anxiety, anticipation, vigilance, or expectation may arise without a clear personal cause because they were never generated from your present circumstances in the first place. They were learned as ambient conditions rather than deliberate conclusions. Once this becomes visible, the relationship with mental activity shifts without effort. A thought can be noticed as a passing signal rather than a directive that requires engagement. Awareness receives it, recognizes its texture, and allows it to move without accumulation. There is no need to trace it, resolve it, or assign it meaning. The system no longer mobilizes around content that does not require response. This alone reduces the volume of internal noise significantly. As mental activity is allowed to pass through without being held, attention naturally returns to direct experience. Sensation becomes clearer. Perception becomes more grounded. The body responds to what is actually present rather than to interpretations layered on top of it. Breathing settles, posture adjusts. The nervous system recalibrates to immediacy. This is not a state that needs to be maintained. It emerges as a result of no longer carrying what does not belong to the moment. This shift alters how energy moves through the system. The effort once spent managing internal narratives becomes available for responsiveness. Decisions arise with less internal negotiation because fewer competing signals are being amplified. Action feels simpler, not because life has become less complex, but because fewer assumptions are being projected onto it. The system becomes efficient rather than reactive. In daily life, this shows up quietly. Conversations unfold without internal rehearsal. Listening becomes more complete because attention is not divided. Responses arrive without being filtered through expectation. The body remains present rather than braced. Others sense this coherence without needing explanation, as nervous systems communicate long before language does. Interactions feel grounded because there is less internal fluctuation shaping them. As awareness remains steady, emotional states complete themselves more naturally. Sensations rise and fall without being prolonged by mental commentary. Feelings move through the body without becoming stories that need resolution. This allows regulation to occur without force. The system trusts its own capacity to process experience when it is not being overridden by inherited mental patterns. With less internal accumulation, identity begins to feel less constructed. There is no longer a need to define yourself moment by moment through mental content. Presence carries its own continuity. You remain intact across changing circumstances because identity is no longer assembled from passing signals. This stability does not feel rigid. It feels spacious, allowing experience to move freely without leaving residue. This is where participation in life changes its quality. Engagement becomes more precise because it is rooted in what is actually happening rather than what is being anticipated. Effort is applied where it is needed and released where it is not. Attention follows relevance rather than habit. The system responds to reality directly without mediation through outdated interpretations. As this integration deepens, the sense of separation between inner and outer experience softens. What you feel internally aligns more closely with what is occurring externally because fewer inherited signals are distorting perception. This alignment does not require vigilance. It sustains itself through clarity. Awareness remains present, the mind functions as needed, and identity stays anchored in something stable rather than reactive. This prepares the ground for the final movement of this transmission. When awareness is no longer entangled with borrowed mental activity, and when identity is no longer constructed from passing content, something essential becomes clear. What remains is not an absence, but a presence that does not fluctuate with thought. From this orientation, the way you move through life is no longer driven by what arises in the mind, but guided by a deeper coherence that does not need explanation. And it is from this coherence that the final shift becomes possible, not as an idea to adopt, but as a lived orientation that continues beyond this moment and into the way you meet whatever comes next. As this transmission reaches its completion, what remains is not a conclusion, but a recognition that has been quietly integrating throughout your listening. The internal pressure to interpret, resolve, or manage your experience has softened, and in its place there is a steadier orientation, one that does not rely on effort or control. The mind continues to function, producing language, planning, and evaluation when needed, but it no longer occupies the center from which you live. Presence feels more stable because it is no longer assembled moment by moment from mental activity. This shift does not announce itself dramatically, yet it carries a profound simplicity. You are still fully engaged with life, still thinking, still feeling, still responding, but the place you are responding from has changed. Identity is no longer fused with the movement of the mind, and because of that, experience unfolds with less internal friction. Situations arise and resolve without the same weight, emotions move without lingering unnecessarily, and decisions feel clearer because they are not burdened by inherited urgency. As awareness remains the ground rather than the background, participation in life takes on a different quality. Attention stays with what is actually present instead of being pulled repeatedly into internal rehearsal. Listening becomes more complete because fewer internal signals compete for focus. Action emerges naturally from relevance rather than anticipation. The system trusts its own responsiveness again because it is no longer being overridden by patterns that were never meant to guide the present moment. From this orientation, the way life responds feels more fluid. Interactions unfold with less resistance, timing aligns more naturally, and effort finds its proper scale. This is not because circumstances have been controlled or outcomes predicted, but because the signal being stabilized is coherent. When awareness is not fragmented by identification with mental content, the body, attention, and perception align, and reality responds to that alignment through ease rather than friction. What becomes clear here is that this coherence is not something you must maintain through vigilance. It sustains itself through recognition. Each time the mind generates content, awareness is already present to receive it. Each time attention drifts, noticing brings it back without effort. There is no requirement to eliminate thought or manage experience. The return happens automatically whenever you recognize where you are observing from. This recognition gradually reshapes identity in a way that feels natural rather than constructed. You are no longer defining yourself through internal commentary or emotional states. Continuity comes from presence itself, which remains intact across changing circumstances. This stability does not feel rigid or fixed. It feels spacious, allowing life to move freely without needing to defend or reinforce a sense of self. As this settles, many people notice a subtle but unmistakable internal shift. The version of you that began listening is not identical to the one here now, even though nothing externally dramatic has occurred. The difference lies in orientation rather than information. Something essential has moved from the background to the foreground of experience, and once noticed, it becomes difficult to ignore. This moment is what your template calls the activation threshold, not as a concept, but as a lived transition. It is the point where recognition becomes embodied enough to be acknowledged. Naming it is not about making it permanent or proving anything to anyone else. It is simply a way of allowing the system to register what has already changed and to anchor that recognition into your ongoing experience. Writing can serve that function quietly and effectively. When a statement is written from this place, it is a reflection of what is already present. It allows the nervous system to integrate the shift relationally, reinforcing coherence without force or expectation. If this recognition feels accurate for you, take a moment and mark it in a simple way. Write this in the comments to anchor the shift. I am aware of my mind, not ruled by it. Only write it if it feels true for you, as an acknowledgement of what has already become clear. As you move on from here, notice that this orientation does not end with the video. Awareness remains present wherever attention goes. The mind continues to function, life continues to unfold, and you now know where to stand while it does.